Hi everyone. I just wanted to take you through a quick refresher of something that you probably learned in 8th grade, the idea of how bills become laws, and this is really not going very far in depth, but it is going to review the process and specifically try to link up the three different branches of the US government so that we can then use that information to compare and contrast it with the ideas of the Roman Republic that we went over today in class. So I'm just going to kind of take you through this process. First of all, we have our three branches of government, and to create a law, it starts with the legislative branch. So we have the legislative branch here, and the legislative branch has two houses. It has the House of Reps, and it has the Senate. And a bill can start in either one of these two different houses. A tax bill has to start in the House of Representatives, but otherwise, it's pretty much the same. Once the bill passes one of the two houses, it goes to the other one, indicated by this arrow here. If it is passed by both houses, typically that doesn't always happen straight as is. Most of the time, the bills will be modified and then have to be sent back to committee or something along those lines. From there, it then heads to the president. And the president is the executive branch. Okay? And from the president then has multiple options. The president can sign it, at which point that bill becomes a law. The president can veto it. We think back, it means I deny. The idea that the president is saying no. Sometimes what will happen is the president will say, you know, I don't mind the ideas of this necessarily, but I would think that we should make these modifications. From there, it'll get sent back into committee and back into the houses of Congress, and then the process will kind of start again. The third option is what we call a pocket veto, and a lot of times this will happen if the president doesn't necessarily want to sign the bill as is, also doesn't want to send it back to Congress because the president might be afraid that Congress will overrule the veto with a 2/3 supermajority, and the president thinks, well, with the next Congress coming in, perhaps it'll be a little bit easier to veto this and not be so concerned about it being overruled. Whatever the case, once the president signs it, at some point it gets signed, and from this point, it then goes into law. And that's great. That's all well and good. Once it becomes a law, it's a law. Now, where the Supreme Court is going to come into this is if a case questioning the legality of that law is brought to the attention of the Supreme Court. And again, this is a very kind of surface level look at laws and how the United States government is set up. But, for example, the example I used in class is if an additional tax is made for somebody who wears a Pittsburgh Penguins jersey. That person can say, well, you know, under the Equal Protections Clause, that's not really fair, and so I'm going to basically challenge that law. If that's the case, if there's a case against a particular law, and it goes through the appellate court system, and then eventually it gets brought to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has options. The Supreme Court doesn't have to take on every case that someone brings to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court can then choose, and again, this is the judicial branch. The Supreme Court can then choose whether to hear the case or not. And let's assume for the purposes of this example that the Supreme Court chooses to hear this particular case. The Supreme Court can then make a ruling. Ruling number one is, it's okay. That law falls in line with the federal laws of the United States Constitution, and that law is considered constitutional, and so from this point forward, it will be considered legal. The other option is unconstitutional, meaning that the particular law goes against something directly from the United States Constitution, and as a result, that law is then stricken from the record. It is no longer a law across the United States of America, and from that point forward, there's no issue with it. The case has been argued, the case has been won. So that's a very, very brief overview of how the three branches of government interact. That doesn't take into account some of the other checks and balances that we mentioned that you'll want to make sure that you know about, but it does take a brief look. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Thanks.